Welcome to today's presentation. Today, we're going to have a person dear to us. It's Dr. Norbella Miranda. She's going to be talking about a bilingual Colombia policy appropriation into public schools in Cali, a close look at the research, design, and presentation of results. This is our eighth session of the Professional and Academic Development Series, PADS. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about our colleague, Norbella Miranda. First of all, she is a faculty professor at Escuela de Ciencias del Lenguaje. She holds a BA in foreign languages in ELT, an MA in education, and a PhD in education with specialization in bilingualism. She carries out outreach projects with local schools and plan in Cali in the areas of language policy and planning, multilingualism, and EFL curriculum. She's also a member of our group, EILA, and so she's been very active academically during the last years. For example, one of her latest publications includes Appropriation of Colombian ELT policy in a targeted school, the creation of an elite yet needed school in the public education system. And she also has several chapters in very well-known edited volumes. So I would like to thank you, Professor Miranda, for being with us today.
Thank you for this opportunity to talk to such a nice group. I'm going to be talking, as Jose Aldemar said, about this research that I carried out for 5 years. And I wanted to have a look at this research because I wanted to concentrate to focus on the research design and also on the presentation of results. I know that you know that in these parts we try to like study different parts of the research. So I wanted to have a look at that. I mean, I know that that was missing in our presentation. So this is what we're going to be doing, and I'm going to start sharing my screen. So please let me know if you can see it now.
Yes, we can see the screen now.
Okay, perfect. So this is the title of the PADS, Bilingual Colombia Policy Appropriation into Public Schools in Cali, a close look at the research design and presentation of results. Okay. And I want to start with this question. If I would like to know if you had done research about language policy and planning, or if you have included, or are you planning to include language policy and planning as part of your previous research or the current research that you're carrying out? So what's your experience with language policy and planning and research? I don't think I can read the chat, so no, I cannot read the chat. So perhaps you can jump in and say something, or maybe Carlos can help me reading out.
No, there are no comments in the chat.
All right.
But well, yes, I have worked or some studies with especially curricular documents or official guidelines in educational policies related to language teaching.
Okay, yeah. Curriculum is always linked to language policy and planning. What we call language policy and planning is, in fact, in our context, educational planning. So that's part of like educational goals and planning and all that. And the way I ask the question is because you can either do research about language policy and planning, like to focus on that, or you can do your research on different topics, different themes, different problems, and include a strand on language policy and planning. Anyway, I mean, even if you don't do research about language policy and planning, there's always space to say something about language policy and educational policy.
Norbella?
Yes?
Omaira made a comment on the chat, and then she says this: de alguna manera, cuando se hace investigación en enseñanza y aprendizaje, se tocan estos aspectos. No lo he hecho con estos temas como objeto central de estudio, but she's acknowledging that policy is always there underneath whatever research you do.
Exactly, and that's what I wanted to say at the end. That is always there. Even if you don't do research about language policy, you can always include like a framework of the policy in the country. And if you are doing like research in a school, then of course the policy is within the school. Okay, so this is what I'm going to be presenting today, and I hope I have enough time. Yeah. So something, but not too much, about the background of the study, and then the research study itself, then the design, and now the presentation of results in general, and of course your comments and questions. Anyway, I have the comments and questions at the end, but I guess if you have any questions or comments in the middle, you can just ask. So, something about the background. You will probably know this. I mean, this has been with us, the first picture, the standards for some years now. Yes, and then the basic learning rights. And then this is for like for all schooling. And then we have something for primary school. No, all these are expressions of language policy, right? The curricular guidelines, the material for classroom use. And of course, you know, maybe you know this already if you are working in schools, or even if you don't work at school and you teach future teachers, then you probably have studied this, you know, the materials, the textbooks, the new the B1 challenge application. And probably some of you might have heard or even participated in this, you know, the national test that the Ministry of Education implements, some immersion programs that they have been implemented also to different parts in the country and in different countries too abroad. The fellowship program, perhaps you had a formador nativo extranjero in your school, or mentorship program, which lasted just 1 year, that was in 2016, with the Ministry of Education sending some peers to schools to help English teachers like to program a curriculum and all that. Now, something that you might be less familiar with is this, that during 4 years, from 2014 to 2018, the national policy planning targeted some schools. So at the beginning, they targeted 41 secretarías de educación, and that represents the 43% of the complete number of secretarías. They also targeted 360 schools, I mean official, like public schools, and that is 0.8, not even 1% of the schools in the country. 1,400 teachers, and that's the 8.8% of English teachers, and 128,000 students. And that is 2% of the total number of children that are at schools right now. So this is a strategy that they call focalización, that is not just for Programa Nacional de Bilingüismo, it's not just for education, but this is a broad policy that the country has to send resources to specific groups. Of course, they try to send these resources to schools which need it. In this case, that's what it says in the paper. But in the reality, it doesn't really happen like that, and you will see that later. This is something that I also found in my research, is that much of the time that one teacher devoted during the school year was for Saber Pro, for the preparation of the for Saber 11 exam. This was not a decision that the teacher made because he wanted to do that, but because he felt pressure from the school and of course from parents and from students. And also, you probably don't know this either, that in some cases, much of the time, there are no classes in schools. And this happens for many different reasons. Because there are some marches, because it rained and the school is flooded with water, because the teacher had a medical appointment, because there are some, and this is very frequent, because there are some events at school, like they have to do different things. So the actual number of classes is reduced. Okay, and also, I don't know if you know this, but the textbook has become, in some cases, the embodiment, what I call the environment of the language policy in the ET classroom. Through the use of the textbook, the teachers or English teachers can adopt the policy, they can adapt the policy, they can reject it, or they can even create micro policies in the classroom. So this is what I'm going to be talking at the end with the results. But for now, I want to show my research. Right, so you probably know this. This is very common. This has appeared in many presentations, like a timeline with the different official policies in some planning that the Ministry of Education has implemented. So that started in 2004, and you know that the name changed throughout the years. Now we have a new program. It's called, well, it's weird because it's called Fortalecimiento de las Lenguas Extranjeras, but in the middle it also says Bilingual Colombia. So I don't know exactly which name it is at this point. Anyway, it has had different names, right? They have the National Ministry of Education has also developed some curricular guidelines, as you can see here, estándares, todos los estándares y las guías del 2016. They published like 4 different books and also classroom materials. Okay, what were the conversations about language policy and planning for ELT when I started my research? And this was in 2012 that I began. These were conversations that were not only happening here in Colombia, but also abroad, and especially in Asia and Latin America. Number one, the goals of the policy were always connected to interests that go beyond education. And normally this has to do with economy. So you have to learn English to become a globalized country, to improve the number of trades and all that. Also, this was another a category that I found, that the policy creation was a top-down process, and we leave that here. That was clear. And also the adoption of foreign standards, but that was also happening, as I said, in Latin America and in Asia, a little bit less in Africa. There were some bridges between the urban context and the rural context that still persist. We can read the current literature. We can see that very clearly. That bridge between the public and private, right? Between high and low socioeconomic status students coming from those families that either had high income or low income. So that makes a difference. Also, the difference between majority languages and minority languages, plus this reduced concept of bilingualism that sees English learning as bilingualism only. No, and there were also here, especially in Colombia, well, also in Asia, a lot of research studies about the poor conditions for policy implementation. And this has to do with number of students per class, the infrastructure of a school, the resources, the number of hours that they have, no? Okay, and now something that appears, especially in Latin America very often, is primary education, ELT in primary education. That teachers, many of the teachers are not prepared, not because they don't want to be prepared, but basically because there is a legislation, there's also legislation that in which English in primary is taught by teachers who are not licenciados en lenguas. So these teachers who leave the faculties of education, they have to study like English, after the university. So in sum, what I found at that moment was that there was an emphasis on macro level policy discourse. There was also an emphasis on school conditions or in general conditions for policy implementation. There was critique, yes. Most of the study were they were reflecting, there were reflections and all that, but at that point there were few empirical studies. And of course there was a focus on implementation, like how can this policy be implemented in those schools, in general. But also what I noticed, especially like at the end, because you know that when we are doing research like this, of course you do your review at the beginning, but you continue doing that throughout the years that the research lasts. So at the end, like in the last 2 years, I also saw a start or a new wave of language policy and planning research that was centered on micro contexts and a view of policy in practice and policy as practice. So this is basically like the point of a start, the starting point of my research. So now I'm going to move a little bit to talk about some of the concepts that are part of my research. The first one, of course, is what is language policy and planning? And I approach policy from a socio-cultural, ecological, and situated perspective. McCarthy says that policy is not a disembodied thing, but rather a situated sociocultural process. The complex of practices, ideologies, attitudes, and formal and informal mechanisms that influence people's language choices in profound and pervasive ways. So this is quite different from how policy was conceived before. In fact, at the beginning, policy was one thing and planning was like something, that was related, but it was kind of done at a different point at a different moment. From the 90s, policy and planning, like we study that together. We don't conceive that we can talk about policy without talking about planning at the same time. And also we see that like an action, not just as documents, but also what happens in different spaces. So policy is also discourse, but policy is text. So what's this? Policy as discourse, as Stephen Ball says, this is because when there is policy, you feel like you have to do certain things to comply with the policy. So there are constraints, there are some guidelines that you are supposed to follow. So it's kind of a constraining factor in your practice. But policy is also seen as text. And it means that policies in general, they can be read in many different ways. They can be interpreted in different ways according to the previous experiences of the teacher in this case, or the context or the expectations that the teacher has. So it's always like this. You have some constraints, but you also have some space to do different things. And this is the famous policy onion that was, this concept was coined by Vicento and Nancy Homberger. And they see policy as in different layers, no? So we have a national layer where all those broad objectives and legislation are normally issued, right? We have institutional layer, like the schools, for example, or the church, or at work, no? Where there is diverse situated, these contexts are diverse, they are situated, and these regulations that are coming from the national layer. They come here and they are interpreted and they are implemented or appropriated. And there is this layer of interpersonal interactions This is also a way to see policy, like it's not only the documents, it's not only the actions, but it's also how we interact with each other. Now, all these different layers are influenced also by the supranational layer, which also brings in some ideologies and some ways to do things. Now, regarding policy processes, when we study language policies, we don't just look at the way it is appropriated. We used to say implemented, now we say appropriated, and you see the difference now. But we also talk about policy creation, because we now say that policy is not created just at the national level, but also in different levels of the policy onion. So we look at how policy is created. We look also at the interpretation of policy in these different layers, and the appropriation, right? In those layers, and also the instantiation. And this is a concept that hasn't been so much worked. It has to do with how language is used as part of policy implementation or in policy appropriation. Like what changes, in what ways language is used, if we are talking about like this policy is affecting this, for example, this classroom discourse. So that would be instantiation. Now, at schools and in general in schooling, we see that language policies are related to curriculum. Normally, language policies for schools, they are part of curricular reform because they want to reform the curriculum, right? And then I like this schema very much because it relates, I think it relates to this. No? So according to Deng, we have like 3 different domains. They call domains of curriculum planning. So there is an institutional domain that if you relate that to the policy onion, it would be like the national layer of policy, right? So you have the institutional domain where you have like the main goals of education for this country, like the general guidelines and all that. But then you have the programmatic domain, and this is where all the documents, curricular documents, are designed also sent to schools, right? So this is this domain is a domain that links the institutional layer and the classroom layer. And you have the classroom layer, and that's where the curriculum is enacted, no? Because this is a way to see also curriculum, not just as a document, but also a way of doing things in the school, in the classroom in this case. And I wanted to include here Orlando Chavez and Fanny Hernandez, because they do have a very clear, let's say, way to present the documents in the school. Is not only you have el PI, but in the schools we have el PI, planes de área, planes de aula. So all this is part of what Deng calls a classroom. But in our reality, it's more than classroom. It's a school and also classroom. Now, so what's appropriation then? Because this is in the title of my research. So what's appropriation and what's the big deal? What's the difference between appropriation and implementation? And I think I will start with this. Reading this, I said that appropriation differs from implementation in that why implementation is focused on changing behavior to accommodate practices to prescribe top-down laws and guidelines. Appropriation highlights policy agents' meaning making. Thus, the concept of appropriation points out to the active process of borrowing, recontextualizing, remodeling, and resignifying cultural forms, including languages. So there is a difference between appropriation and implementation. The early studies in policy they were looking mostly as of implementation, like how is this policy being put into practice in the school. Now we see that as an active process of the schools and the teachers. Okay. So appropriation, according to Levinson and Sutton, it refers to ways in which creative agents interpret and take in elements of policy and incorporate those discursive resources into their own scheme of interaction, interest, motivation, and action. So this is more like an active process. And it has to do, as it says here, with what the teacher thinks, with his or her previous experiences, what his or her expectations are, and of course, the resources and the contextual conditions that he or she has at school. Now, this is a concept. Appropriations is linked then to agency. An agency, in many authors say that agency is like a key concept right now in language policy, in the sense that it kind of changed the perspective in which we were looking at language policy. So agency is considered the socio-culturally mediated capacity to act. So in order to appropriate policy, you many times you enact, you work on your agency. It says here that a policy actor becomes a policy agent when their actions are not rule governed or rule oriented. So if you remember this, then where is it? Then a person that implements a policy would be a policy actor, and a person that appropriates a policy would be a policy agent, no? So there is engagement in the exercise of power to bring about effects and to reconstitute the world if you use your agency. Teacher agency, this is agency in general, like from anthropology, but in educational studies, teacher agency is an emergent phenomenon partly shaped by the situated context in which it is exercised. It includes, but is not limited to, personal capacity. This is huge. I mean, this is what they say, is that this is a slippery concept, because there are some authors that say that agency is only a personal trait. Like, you have to have agency. You either have or don't have agency. Whereas people like Priestley, Biesta, and Robinson, they said that agency is situated. That you, of course, you have this capacity, but you have to use that capacity in a particular context. The context will limit, or it will increase, and it will promote your agency. The same authors, Priestley, Biesta, and Robinson, they have this approach.
Excuse me, Norbella.
Yeah.
Well, do you prefer that we leave some the comments and questions for the end? Or because there have been a couple of comments in the chat. I don't know if you want to read them right now or at the end.
Oh, it's very nice to do it right now, Carlos. Yes, please. Okay, let me see here.
Okay. Well, so Andres Potes, he commented that educational policies reflect pedagogical conceptions, strategies for developing towards certain political goals and even economic interests. As teachers, we are all involved with policies since our job has to respond to the legislation of framework. The problem is that stakeholders are not usually invited to participate in the creation of policies. And Maria Eugenia Wapacha asked whether is there a definition for student agency?
Yes. Well, Andres, yes, you are totally right. What has characterized like official policies in general is that they have formed in a top-down process. And normally teachers, parents, and students are not called to be part of this policy creation. What this has, brought about The consequences of this is that normally policies are way beyond the capacities of some schools. Like if you want your students to have a B1 level, for example, then you will have to have some conditions in order to reach that. And if your school is a rural school, if there is no teacher, and that happens many times, there are no English teachers, then it's going to be impossible, rather difficult, if not impossible, to reach a policy. And that is because people teachers and parents and students and even rectores, no principals, they are not invited in general. Is there a definition of a student agency? Yes, Maru. This is one of the latest studies, latest research. There is, especially in Asia, there are some studies on student agency, and you can see that because they call it like students policing, language, and is that when there is a policy in a school, in a classroom, that has become a policy between teachers and students because of a repetitive pattern, then the students themselves, they asked their classmates to follow the policy. So yes, there has been a study on student agency. They are like more recent than teacher agency, but yeah, there are studies on that. Yeah, it is very interesting. Yeah. So let me continue presenting if there are no other questions or comments. All right, perfect. So I was showing here, this is a framework by Priestley, Biesta, and Robinson to approach a teacher agency, and they call that an ecological approach. And I really like this, and I used it in my research because I think that it reflects exactly, it reflects pretty much what teachers live in your schools and what factors influence their exercise, the exercise of their agency. So they talk about an irrational dimension, which has to do with teachers' life histories and their professional histories, like where they come from and all that. And I saw that in one of the cases, I saw, for example, that since the very beginning, one of the teachers that was part of my research, he had a very difficult life. Well, he even had to walk like every morning to look for water and all that to a place. And he managed to come to Cali to study languages despite of so many difficulties. But he came here without even having a home to stay. And if you follow the teacher throughout his performance in the classroom, and not only in the classroom but also in extracurricular activities, you always see this drive to change things despite of the many difficulties that he had. So yes, so you have this dimension, like the interrational dimension, that has to do with past lives. Then you have the practical evaluative dimension that has to do with the moment, el ahora, now. So it has to do with the cultural the cultural aspect, like ideas, values, beliefs, and discourses that are around not only the classroom, but also in the country. The structural aspect that has to do with ideologies, that surround also language teaching, and also the material aspect that has to do with resources, the physical environments of the classroom and all that. So this affects your agency as a teacher. And there's also a projective dimension that has to do with your goals, your short-term goals or long-term goals, like what do you expect from your students and from your teaching in general. So all this influence the way you exercise your agency as a teacher. Okay, and of course, bilingualism. So, this is also a concept that has been contested in different ways. And now we talk about bilingualism and multilingualism. That's the latest trend. I wanted to bring in a definition that I think reflects, what I consider to be bilingualism is all instances in which communication occurs in two languages, bringing to the fore subjectivities, identities, and power relations. So bilingualism doesn't have to do only with language, right? It has to do with how people feel, how they project to the rest of the people, to the power that they have in a kind of, in an interaction, in another interaction. So all this that has to do with language, it's also involved in bilingualism. Also, I brought here Baker's quote to show that when you are bilingual, you don't have to be what they used to say, like fully bilingual or fully monolingual. No, bilingualism is like a continuum. And the moment you start using the language, you can be called bilingual, right? If you look from a positive perspective, you would be an emerging bilingual. So you are not like, no, todavía no es bilingüe. He's becoming bilingual. So she's an emerging bilingual. So Baker talks about this multicolor landscape of bilingual abilities that can be more or less developed. And also, it means that you don't have to to have the highest level or the C2 level in the foreign language skills. So it depends on how much you need those skills. You will develop different language ability. So based on this, like all the previous studies and the way I conceive education and bilingualism and also language policy, this is the question that I that I posed, that I made. How do English teachers in public schools interpret and appropriate the educational policy for Spanish English bilingualism in the classroom? So there were a lot of studies, as I said at the beginning, about language policy, official language policy in paper. So I wanted to look at policy within the classroom, but understanding that this classroom is not isolated from what was happening in the city or in the country or even abroad. So I posed at the beginning 4 subsidiary questions, and as I was working on the research, I noticed that I had to work on another one, so that's why I have 5 questions here. So the first one, it had to do with interpretation, so policy interpretation. Then the second question about pedagogical practices and how those practices reflected the adoption, adaptation, or resistance of the language policy. This was the new question, teacher agency. So how those practices reflect teacher agency. And also, what was the relationship between teachers' interpretations and practices? Because sometimes, if I talk to teachers, they were saying some things about how they interpreted the policy, and then I saw something that I consider different in practice. When I talk to teachers in detail, like analyzing my data, my analysis, and what they had to do, I could realize that those practices did relate to those interpretations, because how they conceived the policy was different, from what you would expect. And finally, I also wanted to look at the ideologies that were in those official policy documents and discourses, and how those ideologies reflected also on teachers' discourses. Like, what was the relationship between that? So, research design. So, and this is going to be an open question. Based on that, what do you think? What research design do you think I made? what do you think would be a good design for that? Would it be qualitative design or quantitative, or what instrument do you think I should have used? Any ideas?
Yes, you can respond through the chat, or if you want, just open your microphone and ask. Don't be shy.
This is for me to rest. Es para descansar también un poquito. So I'm gonna show you
So, a multiple case study.
a multiple case study. Yeah. Okay. So maybe to look at the school. Yeah, to look at some schools. Maru, you were going to say something.
Oh no, yes, I was asking you to go back to the slide of the research question to read it.
Ethnographic
Well, I think it's a
design.
qualitative study. If you focus on some schools, that could be case study or multiple case studies. And well, I think that observations, questionnaires could be the instruments to collect this information. Some documentary analysis, probably.
All right. Perfect. Okay, so let me show you what I did, which is very close to what Maru just said. Right, so I did a qualitative study, yes. I follow an ethnography of language policy, which is relatively new in the field in language policy and planning, ethnography of language policy and planning. And I used discourse analysis. This was a multi-sited research, and I did use a case study, as Carlos and Maru said. So why qualitative? Why did I use a qualitative study? Because I wanted to see what the phenomenon in its natural setting. I wanted to see that. I didn't want to do any experiments and all that. I just wanted to understand what this language policy in the setting. I wanted to hear participant voices, like to hear teachers, right? Like to hear what they needed to say, because sometimes or many times they are portrayed as villanos or villains, like Adriana Gonzalez says. So I wanted to see what was happening, what the teachers had to say about this, about policy. I knew that I needed to spend time to do this research, right? To really understand their way to appropriate policy. And I wanted to give a rich description of the context to understand those actions, those policy actions, what they were doing at school. And I used inductive methods, like most of, if not all, the analysis of the categories came from the data, okay, like a bottom-up process. And also, as I said at the beginning, I wanted to portray this subjective experience of a teacher, and I was not looking for universal truth. Now, why an ethnography? Okay, ethnography, Johnson and Homberger, Mencken and Garcia and McCarthy, they said that they offer unique insights into language policy and planning processes through the descriptions of policy interpretation and appropriation at the local level, and also with the various layers through which a policy must pass. So this is very important, because I didn't want to just limit my understanding of the policy within the school and within the classroom. I wanted to see that in connection with other layers of the policy onion. So, and I used this framework by Johnson, in which I looked at policy agents, it means the people, at policy goals that had to do with intention, at the different processes for policy, like creation, interpretation, appropriation, and incitation. And of course, I looked at the discourses that surrounded the policy and the context, not only the immediate context, but also the social, historical, and physical context. I said that I used discourse analysis, so I used two different discourse analysis methods. One was, or methodologies. One was critical discourse analysis, basically with the documents and also with the official discourse, like what the Ministry of Education was saying at the moment, what the news were saying at the moment about policy, and of course the official policy documents. So I wanted to look at the power, like how was power being exercised in those documents, like who was shown as powerful and powerless, what ideologies were behind that, and how all this was connected to the history of language policy and planning in Colombia. And I also used a classroom discourse analysis. This was something that I added to my research, like perhaps in the second year, I hadn't thought of this, but then when I did some piloting, that was in 2013, and I realized that I needed to use another tool to understand what was happening in the classroom. So I used classroom discourse analysis to understand this routine discourse between the teachers and the students. I have something more here about classroom discourse. Marilyn Martin Jones says that classroom discourse allows us to see the ways in which languages are appropriated, navigated, or contested by teachers in the classrooms. Okay, and this was a multi-sited study that lasted 5 years. I did phase one, divided like in 3 phases. It shows here like in order, but in reality, sometimes I did macro with macro and meso with macro and all that. I mean, in general, it was like this, but I didn't like forget the other phases when I was concentrated on the micro. So I did research on policy documents, interviews with policy agents in Bogota, the policy creators, and then I analyzed the policy agent discourse. In a second phase, I looked at the meso level, and I mean the city, when I talk about the meso level. So I participated actively in some council sessions to talk about policy in Cali. And then that was the first time they were proposing the policy. And then I interviewed also some key local policy agents, like the coordinator for bilingualism in Cali and some other people. And also I analyzed some local policy documents. And this was phase 3. I did this in 2016. So I went to schools and I observed English classes of 11th grade of teachers. And I did some interviews with key participants, of course, teachers. They were the most important participants, but I also interviewed the principal, students, and other teachers too. I did some video recording, audio recording, and I also studied some school documents and artifacts. This was a case study, a multiple case study with 2 cases. Remember that a case as stake, Robert Stake says, is a noun, a thing, or identity that you want to understand like in detail. And to study a case, he says, we carefully examine its functioning and activities. But the first objective of a study is to understand the case. So this understanding of a case study led me to present the results in the way I presented them. And I will show you that a little bit later. So some the data collection methods that I used was observation. At the beginning was non-participant, and then it became participant observation. Of course, field notes, audio and video recordings, semi-structured interviews, and documents in general. This is the data analysis. So I used 3, let's say, framework. One was ethnographic analysis, with this reading and rereading and looking and relooking at my notes and the interviews and the documents to find trends, to find categories, and then to convert those categories into themes. I used, as I said before, classroom discourse analysis for class audios and videos, where I looked at teachers and the student discourse, and of course the interaction. Although I kind of recorded and many videos and audios. I just focused on some segments that I found significant. And I also looked at some contextualization cues, no, and the interactional patterns. And I used discourse analysis, critical discourse analysis, and the strategy of intertextuality to look at ideologies in official discourse and those interconnections between the different categories, between different sources of data, but also between or among the different layers. And at the end, I compare and contrasted those two cases, no? What Robert Stay calls cross-case analysis. Well, I wanted to mention this, is that when I was looking, as I said at the beginning of my research, I had not considered doing classroom discourse analysis. Then I realized that I needed to do it when I did a piloting in 2013. After that, I realized that I needed more elements because I was analyzing the data based on themes and all that, but I thought that I needed more. So I brought this concept into my research, and that helped me a lot to understand what was happening in the classroom. This is what Gumpers calls contextualization cues, and maybe you know them, no? These are like those features of linguistic forms that tell you something, that something is there happening. For example, when the teacher was code switching, why does it tell me as a researcher, why was he code switching? Why did he use some expressions in some particular moments of the classroom? And this was repetitive. Why did he, let's say, use certain prosodic, certain accents and all that? So I realized that I needed to understand those little details in the use of the language. So this is what Homberger calls methodological reach points. This is when in your research, you notice that you need to adjust something. Could be either that has to do with either the research design, or maybe you need to bring in some conceptual tool that you didn't have before. In my case, it was contextualization cues that I used there. So these are the context for the research. So I worked, as I said, with two schools, Líderes School in Melilla, Zamora. Of course, these are not the real names. These are names that were given by the teachers. You can see information here from the schools, right? They are like different. One is older than the other. If you look at Líderes, it has 12 sedes, so it's a huge school, very big school, while Melilla Zamora has only 2, no? And you can also look at the strata, no, and the number of students and the number of teachers. When you see this, the first thing that comes to your mind is, well, if the government is going to focalize a school, which one should the government focalize? Which schools should the government be targeting? And you will be surprised that Líderes was not a targeted school, but it was Melilla Zamora, with fewer number of students, with fewer number of schools. Of course, the construction, the building was newer and all that. So this is something that I wanted to also tell you about the context. Because the schools, being focalized or not focalized, brings in some, let's say, advantages or disadvantages. So if you are focalized, for example, if you are targeted, then you will receive the textbook, like in Melilla Zamora. You will have the presence of el formador nativo extranjero. You could have Gestores del Ministerio. You could have the printed curricular guidelines. Of course, they are online, but if you're focalized, you receive that. And you could be part of professional development programs, and teachers could take, and also students could take the aptitude test, which is for a very small number of teachers and students. While if you are not, then you won't receive much of this. In this case, the teacher in Líderes, he was part of a teacher immersion. He had been part of teacher immersion in San Andres a few years ago, and he had the first version of the textbook because the Secretaría de Educación received the new textbooks, so they were just giving the old textbooks to other schools, so he received that. So you can see here that, that it makes a difference of being focalized or not focalized. I'm talking about focalization by the Ministry of Education. I'm not referring at this point of the work that Secretarías de Educación do, because they do a lot of work, but I'm not talking about that, but only about national a bilingual program. This is La Escuela Líderes. So you can see here the resources. They're working with the book. This is English Phase 3. And this is Melilla Zamora, right? This is what they call La Sala de Bilingüismo. And they had, you cannot see here, but there were some computers on the left side of the classroom. There was also a TV screen. And the students had access to the textbook, the new textbooks, right? The person that you see at the back, this is a fellow teacher. He was from England, and he had been in the school for a semester. No, I mean for 3 months when I came, and he was going to stay for a semester. This is the participant teachers, information about them, right? Both of them licenciados en lenguas, both of them with maestrías, and you can see the number of years in that differ, no? Something that I noticed in these two cases is that being in a school for some years will have an effect on the way you can appropriate the policy. Jose in Melilla Zamora, he felt free to, freer to do what he really wanted to do in the classroom. Antonio in Líderes, he was constrained by the fact that the principal wanted him to focus on la preparación del ICFES. And he had been just transferred from a school, from una sede to the main school, and he wanted to be there. So he felt that he needed to comply with what the principal was telling him to do. This is just for you to see. This is just the famous framework to show the research, right? With the questions and all that. From the question to the analysis of the data. Now, the presentations of results. Let me see how much time I have. Yeah, yes. So, presentation of results. This is what I did. This is taken from my thesis. So I had 4 chapters to present the results. The first one was on ideologies of coming from the official policy. No, so first chapter was about ideologies. Second chapter, I focused on one of the cases, el profesor Antonio en el colegio Líderes. No, remember when I read about a case that we needed to understand a case in its particularity, so I wanted to show that here. Like I wanted to show this particular case and not do a cross case at the first moment. So that's why I decided to do it like this, like the first case, then Antonio in la Escuela Líderes, and then I focused on Jose in la Escuela Melilla Zamora. So how they appropriated and how they interpreted the policy. And then in chapter 8, in the 4th chapter of results, then I worked on a cross-case analysis. Look how these two people, what they had in common, how they were approaching differently or similarly the policy. So policy ideologies, this is chapter 5. No, so one of the main themes was that English was for economic development, and this relates to the literature that I had read, here in Colombia and outside and abroad. So English is for work, English is for globalization, and English is for to be competitive, for competitiveness. Now I wanted to show you here. This is, and look at the year. This is 2005. So this is the very beginning of the policy. And here the Ministry of Education, María Cecilia Vélez White, she was mentioning that English es una competencia que tiene, esa competencia tiene efectos diferentes sobre el mercado laboral y habla también sobre movilidad y flexibilidad, mercado laboral, economía global, negocio, necesidades de cliente y costos. So everything that had to do with work, no? So it doesn't talk about like culture, or broadening horizons in terms of understanding others, but it was pretty much focused on this at the beginning. And I wanted to bring 2 more years to show you that this discourse was maintained by the official policy. Also, 2006, they talk about oportunidades laborales, y educativas. And then in 2015, so like 10 years after, the first moment, then they still talk about oportunidades laborales y profesionales. So this discourse, traveled around a lot of the different years. Now, what was the strategies? I could say much more about this, but I know that I don't have much time, so I'm gonna move here to what was some of the strategies to reinforce what I call the knowledge-based economy ideology. One was the high-stakes exam, Saber 11. It exerted pressure on teachers, not only on teachers, but also on principals. And this way to name the policy as a challenge. So policy was always a challenge. And let me show you this. This was this was an interview that I had with the British Council con la directora del área de educación, who was part of the creation of the first policy, the standards and all that. So she was saying, when they talk about, they were deciding that the effect that the Saber 11 was going to test students' ability. So she said this, hubo académicos muy respetados que se opusieron, pero durísimo, a la idea de ponerle Saber 11, como un benchmark. Esta idea porque ellos planteaban que no puede ser posible que vamos a poner un B1, como una meta cuando no estábamos listos, y el B1 se iba a reflejar en el examen, y dice aquí, nos vamos a rajar, Decían, yo sé que vamos a salir mal. Pero me devuelvo un poquito, dice, y la respuesta de la ministra fue, yo sé que vamos a salir mal, si no lo ponemos, ¿cuándo vamos a estar listos? Y ella en ese momento tomó la decisión de darse la pela. Y continúa, nos vamos a rajar, yo sé que vamos a salir mal y seguiremos saliendo mal unos años. Entonces eso le genera un poco, digamos, de malestares a las instituciones educativas. Ese rajarse, if you remember reading the newspapers, that rajarse appears like every year after the effects scores are shown, are released. So quienes están rajando, who the people who are rajándose, are the teachers. It's not the people that created the policy that didn't take this into account, that it was not possible to reach a B1, but now the responsibility was transferred to the teachers and to the schools. And this and she began saying that this was a reto, Eso era un reto, and the reto started in 2005, as you can see here. Then it was retaken in 2006, 2014, and 2016. So the policy keeps being a challenge, What I say is that if we don't transform either the challenge or conditions, that will never end. This will be a never-ending story. So I say that policy as a challenge, portrayed as a challenge, masks what Stephen Bolt calls dematerialization of the policy in its creation. So the conditions, real conditions, were not taken into consideration when the policy was created, and this relates to what Andres was mentioning. No, that this is a top-down policy that doesn't take into account the material context, as they are called. It also diverts attention from the current failures to plan effective, sufficient, and consistent actions, because they said, okay, this is a challenge, and it's a challenge again, like every year. So you don't have to let's say, provide a definite answers or solutions. And finally, it changes the responsibility for policy success to schools and teachers, and not from the policy creators. Okay, so this is in terms of the chapter 5. In general, there are many other things to say, but in general, I can mention that. And now let's move a little bit to the other chapter on Antonio's policy interpretation and association in El Colegio Líderes. And this is how this decision of bringing in the B1 level to Saberon's exam reflects in the teacher's pedagogical practice and teacher's life and school life. So the teacher said here, decía, yo hago solo hacer muchas dinámicas, pero el ICFES, cuando dice el ICFES, es el examen, ¿no? La presión del ICFES no me dejaba hacer dinámicas. Entonces yo les dije a mis estudiantes, el día que terminemos con ese ICFES, entonces tenemos una fiesta. Y esa fiesta es que ya no tenemos más la presión, ya no tenemos más la cara seria, la estructura, ya podemos, bueno, hacer otras dinámicas, saltar, bueno, otras cosas, ¿no? Poner música. Dice él, una cosa es un desorden ordenado. So as you can see here, the teacher, even though the teacher considered that he wanted to do different things, he wanted to, as he's mentioned many times, he wanted to concentrate on speaking, he really needed to practice, to teach to the test. No, to practice in this case, this means to teach grammar and to teach reading and to teach vocabulary, right? And if you remember that pie that I showed you at the beginning, this was the teacher that that used 61% of the school year to teach to the test, right? So in this case, you can say that his agency was constrained by this policy of that was present in the exam, no? And not only the teacher felt pressure by the exam, also the students. Look at what these students say. This is a student 7. They were in a class and they were talking about the exam and all that. So the students said, well, excited. The teacher was asking them, how do you feel? How do you feel? You're going to take the exam and all that? So she said, excited and nervous. And I'm more nervous about the effects because the effect decided my future, no? So she knew that in case she didn't pass the exam, she was not going to be able to enter the university because this is a student that belongs to strata 1 and 2, or 2 as you saw at the beginning. So their parents didn't have money to send her to a private university. So not only the teacher felt pressure to teach to the test, but the students also knew that part of their future was, it was decided by the score in the effects. Okay, but not only, this is how he takes in elements of the policy. You can say that he adopts the policy that way, but he also adapted. Antonio also adapted the policy. He was also always telling me that it was very important for him that his students could speak English, because before, in the previous year, he said they never had the chance to practice speaking. So he wanted his students to practice speaking. Now, how did he say speaking in his particular case? He saw speaking as students being able to manage some grammar rules, but also with a lot of practice in pronunciation. And this was because it was difficult for him, I think you could remember perhaps his classroom. He had a small classroom with, it was crowded. I mean, he had like 38 students. So it was really difficult for him, like to have working in pairs and all that. So one way that he found in his school to practice speaking was through the practice of pronunciation. And this is an example that we're reading this text from the book, and he was correcting here a student that was reading aloud. So reading aloud was very common in this class. No? The student was reading, and the teacher, then Antonio says, graduate. Now he was correcting this part, and then high school, and then he even says that more explicitly. You don't need a pause. You say high school, no high school. Okay, so repeat. And this was very repetitive in the class, as I said. This was like a pattern. But he also created policy. One of the policies that he created was that every time there was a reading text in the textbook, the students would read aloud, no? So that was one. So reading for them, for the teacher, and for the students meant reading aloud to practice speaking. So that was like established in the school. So you can see here we have two readings. He says, Perez, can you read, please? And when he says, can you read, please, it's can you read aloud, no? So that was a pattern in the school. And also this expression, come on. He used it very much. This was a contextualization cue to show always like encouragement to students. Whenever he wanted students to continue, let's say, trying using the language, he would use this expression, come on. So this was Jose, this was Antonio, and now this is Jose in the other school, in Melia Zamora school. And this is how he interprets the policy goal. He says, if I were, let's say, a representative from the ministry, if I were an active agent of the bilingual Colombian policy, look, he's saying in here, I was not part of policy creation. This is a top-down process. So he said, I'd be very much satisfied with the fact that most of the students in 11th grade reached A2. And he says, I still see difficult for a good portion of the population to reach B1, no? And what he said here, he had like putting it into practice in the English area plan, in the plan de área. If I look at the English area plan, one of the objectives was this: the student demonstrates an A2 level when giving his or personal opinions about an academic topic. So he never used B1, even though this was an 11th grade classroom, no? So he exercised his agency, in this school, to do what he considered was relevant for his student, was pertinent for his students to do in the school. Something that I need to mention now, here is that you would think that like the school authorities would not authorize it, but they did. El rector was always supporting him, and he also, because we talked about this with the rector, and he said, no, I understand that students are not able to reach a B1 level, so I guess an A2 level is okay for this particular school. So he was supporting this teacher. Now Jose also created some policy in the classroom. So one policy that he created was like the interaction between the teacher and the students was all the time going to be in English. He wanted his students to use English all the time. And this is a quote that can show that. He was given some instructions for an oral presentation, and he said, the instruction is that all the group speaks. Everybody speaks, and he was repeating that all the time. So in that particular class, this was a micro policy that the teacher created and that students followed. So he did some representations here, and this is an example of students' use of English. They were using English in the class. So we have those two cases. I have shown really little about them, but I think I tried to bring like the most characteristic, let's say, themes from the schools. And when I did this cross-case analysis, I saw that the use of the textbook was part of a teacher's appropriation of the Colombian policy in the classroom. Now, how did they approach this book from different perspectives? No, Jose and Melia Zamora, he used oral presentations, and Antonio Alidre, he mostly did reading out loud, pronunciation practice, and he personalized the content very much. I didn't mention that, but he did that very much in the classes. Something that was the same for both cases is that the main aim that they had with their students was to increase their students' oral ability, to improve that. They wanted their students to improve it. So look at the different ways they interpreted, they appropriated the policy. So I also identify different techniques in which they appropriated the policy, like adoption, adaptation, rejection, and micro policy creation by doing different things. Like, for example, Antonio, he added a lot of exercises to the official textbook, and that was a way to adapt the policy, while Jose and Melia Zamora, he moved some exercises, like some exercises that were at the end, he would move that to the beginning of the activities and all that. And you can see how they also rejected some part of the policy, like, for example, Antonio, he excluded the teaching methodology. He said that the communicative language teaching was the approach that worked for him. So he didn't think that he needed to use task-based or project-based as the book recommends, or even problems. And Jose, he rejected the View One policy. And also, as I mentioned before, they were also creating some micro policies at the school. Now, what does all this tell us about teacher agency? I found that there were at least two, I found three, I didn't include the other one here, but I in terms of schooling, I found two different forms of agency. One was curricular agency, and this has to do with the decisions and actions that teachers make regarding regarding curriculum planning and enactment. So those decisions that show appropriations, those are agentive action. This is something that they decide to do, and they always mention why they decide to do these things. And these are some examples, like setting an A2 level as the learning goal, using the official textbook, and adapting and rejecting official teaching methodology. There were also some extracurricular agency that I didn't bring to this presentation, but it's present in the research, is that these are agentive actions outside classroom or school borders, and the teachers do. For example, the English Day, this project that the teacher called the Bilingualism Group. This was a group of 11 and 10 graders that worked with one of the teachers, and he would teach them how to teach children. So those students would assist the teachers in primary and preschool education. So it was like some teachers in that school. Also, teachers trying to find scholarships in private institutions for their students, and also preparing and leading a school meeting for ELT policy awareness. Some factors that facilitated teacher agency in the school, the implementation of official policy programs in the school. This helps a lot in terms of understanding the documents, understanding the use of the book and all that. Of course, the school micro context, like how many hours they had, and if they had enough resources and all that. The principal support, and the teacher's prior work experiences. Some barriers to teacher agency, the state exams, as you could see. Also, the absence of official policy strategy in school when the school is not targeted. School management, also the professional cultures in schools, like what do other teachers do regarding English and regarding the relations with the students and all that also plays an important role. And of course, teachers' pedagogical repertoires, like what methods, what methodologies they know in order to teach, no? Some general conclusions, like there are internal contradictions in the official policy. Like, for example, policy tells you that you need to work on 4 language skills, especially oral production, but then you have the national test that only evaluates reading and grammar and vocabulary. I think this is a big contradiction. The policy is always talking about education equity, in how it is important to address this in schools and all that, but at the same time, they have the focalization strategy, no? And also going to a very, very small, as you could see, very small number of schools. Teachers appropriate the various components of the language policy in different ways, like the national test, goals, textbook content, and methodology, as you could see. The schools play a major role in supporting or limiting teachers' agentive actions, and agentive actions are more individual than collective. So you could see teachers like working on their own and not working in groups. And I think this inhibits changes in the school. There's also a disparity of micro-contextual conditions, like schools are very different. Also, they are both public schools, but they are very different. Those unfavorable structural conditions still persist. The ones that we had identified some years ago, they're still there. Of course, there are better conditions now, but there are some conditions that remain. And there is a new gap in public schools through targeting. So what I say is that this strategy that not only is applied in education, but in general in Colombia, is created a gap, no? A gap, in this case, an educational gap between or among public schools. Before, the gap used to be between private and public, and now with this strategy of focalization, then you will find a new gap within public schools. Okay, and that's all that I wanted to share with you.
Thank you very much, Norbella. As I said before, very interesting.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and to all the participants, thank you for attending. Thank you for being here.